In the 1930s, Germany, one of the world's richest, most technologically developed and culturally sophisticated countries, was transformed into an extreme authoritarian state under its dictator Adolf Hitler. His unbridled ambition would plunge the world into a war bloodier and more destructive than any in history. So one of the most important questions from our past is just how Adolf Hitler was able to seize ultimate power.
Hitler was, an exceptional individual in history because he creates this Nazi party from nothing.
He, in the end, believed he was a man of destiny. He described himself as a sleepwalker with providence.
Hitler was born in a German-speaking community of the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire. He failed to get into art school, was rejected by the Austrian army, and made a living painting postcards for tourists while living in a hostel. He found a cause when he volunteered to join the German army when war broke out in 1914.
It's the First World War that transforms Hitler, and it's the fact that Germany loses the war. And he says, doesn't he? He said, I only cried twice in my life. He said the first was when my mother died, and the second when I was in hospital at the end of the First World War, and I was told Germany had lost. And he said, I threw my head on the pillow and I said, it's all in vain.
It actually begins at the end of the First World War when the German military have him attend, as many other men did, these lectures. And it really does arise from that, the whole mysterious and squalid world of the Freikorps, the ultra-nationalist ideas floating around, the whole kind of miasma of ideology and conflict, and over it all the shadow of communism, Red Munich, the terror of the bourgeois that they'd be eliminated, murdered in their beds by communists and so forth. Out of this he emerges, as I say, as a man who sees himself walking with destiny.
Following the defeat and collapse of the German Empire, the nation was caught in a febrile state of competing ideologies, political experiments, street protest, and violence. New political parties jockeyed for position. One of them was a workers' party with a few dozen members. Hitler joined and rapidly took control with powerful speeches, renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and personally designed their symbol, a swastika in a white circle on a red background. It became known as the Nazi Party.
And straight away, they realise he's a great speaker. He makes his way by speaking in beer halls, and that's how he makes his way. And first of all, he's purely an agitator. He's got no idea that he's going to be a politician. And he sort of gets on the coattails of sort of old-fashioned army figures like Ludendorff, General Ludendorff, and von Kahr. He's the kind of right-wing leader of the Bavarian government. And he sort of thinks, oh, I'm going to take over the government with these people.
On the 8th of November 1923, Hitler burst into a rival political meeting in a beer hall in Munich, announcing he was going to overthrow the government. Within 24 hours, his farcical attempt had been crushed by the police. Hitler was put on trial for high treason, but he treated it as a PR opportunity.
In the beer hall, Hitler leaps on a table, takes out his pistol, and fires shots in the air. The whole thing is comical. It's sort of like a South American revolution in the 1930s. It's not like Germany at all. The actual event itself, as it happened, looked and was ridiculous. And of course, the army and police would hear nothing of it. He made these stirring speeches at the trial in his, I think it was 9 months incarceration in Landsberg prison. He wrote Mein Kampf. But it was all a retrospective imposition of imagery and ideas. The whole ritual of the blood flag, the creation of the Munich martyrs, every religion needs martyrs and so forth. All this was a retrospective imposition of design on what was actually a chaotic and incoherent episode.
Hitler was found guilty and sentenced to a paltry 5 years, before being released by the court after just a year in prison. When he was released, he focused on rebuilding the Nazi Party.
I mean, they're just a fringe party with a kind of comical leader, but no one gives them a moment's notice. But they are actually refining various things. They're refining their act. They're refining their iconography. They're refining their imagery. They're refining their whole competence as an organization throughout this time. So something is going on. It's becoming increasingly focused, increasingly professional. And at this time, Hitler is developing, above all, the symbol system. He's spending hours in Munich Public Library researching heraldry and finding the designs and so forth, which are going to project his style, his regime. He's designing the uniforms. They're actually trying to find an ideology. What does Nazism actually mean? In many ways, it means nothing at all. Is it extreme right-wing? Is it extreme left-wing? There is a huge vagueness. They actually have this slogan, we don't want low bread prices, we don't want high bread prices, we don't want bread prices to stay the same. We want National Socialist bread prices. And what they are actually is a kind of catch-all party with a veneer of brutal militarism, but with all kinds of left-wing and ideological and anti-plutocratic appeals as well, and at the margin, and only at the margin at this time, anti-Semitism.
See, Hitler was a little bit like, the Electric Light Orchestra, who I like, but, people would say, but they're quite derivative of the Beatles, and in a way, Hitler was a soaker-up of ideas rather than an original thinker. He wasn't really like, Karl Marx, a detailed scholar with a well-thought-out theory. Hitler was the kind of guy who would buy all the Sunday papers and then he'd pick bits out of them, and then that would become his kind of philosophy for the day. If Hitler had been somewhere else, if he'd been in America, he wouldn't have got anywhere. He was not the type of person who could possibly have got on in American politics. If he'd been in Britain, he wouldn't have got anywhere. I mean, we know Oswald Mosley, pretty good politician, didn't get anywhere. So he had to be in that location. There had to be the crisis in Germany for them to need this individual and those events, those economic events. So can you see it's like a kind of amalgamation between the events and the individual? If an exceptional individual is in the right place at the right time, then they can make a big difference in history. If they're not, if he was in New Zealand, we'd never know. Just talk about that guy who used to go down the pub and rant and rave on about, a master race of New Zealanders,
Hitler and his party might have remained fringe players, were it not for the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, which followed the Wall Street crash of the autumn of 1929.
The American Stock Exchange collapses, and of course then Germany is plunged into this terrible economic depression with 6 million unemployed. And when you think of the big families that people had then, you're talking 30 million are affected. I interviewed a woman called Sigrid Crane. She lived in a place called Garmisch. It's like a skiing resort now. And she said you only had to go through the streets of that town to realise the hunger, that this had really affected the rural population. Now it's interesting, isn't it, that Hitler goes from 2% of votes in 28 and he goes to 37% in 4 years. So he comes to prominence in the period of the worst depths of the Depression.
The breakthrough is 1930 when they get, I think it's 107 members of the Reichstag, and they're the second largest party. And the intervening variable is the Wall Street crash. In other words, that really destroys the German factory. You have as many as 7 million unemployed. And although the worker is proof against, the German worker is invulnerable to the Nazi appeal, as long as he has a job and is a member of the union. Once he's lost his job and has no union, then he's fair game, and he becomes a stormtrooper, joins the SA, joins the Nazi party, and is receptive to their message.
In the midst of the economic crisis, German President Paul von Hindenburg sought to use Article 48 of the Constitution. It allowed him to overrule Parliament, the Reichstag, in emergencies.
You actually had 37 parties in total, and it was anarchy. But you have this anarchy, you don't have agreement in the Reichstag. And so increasingly Brüning takes recourse, the Chancellor takes recourse to Article 48 of the German Constitution with the President Hindenburg's agreement, which allows for direct decrees to be made law without the involvement of the Reichstag. So it makes the notion of dictatorship much more acceptable because we can't create coherent parliamentary rule. This is the core of the matter.
Despite condemnation from the parliament, Hindenburg refused to change and instead he dissolved the Reichstag and called an election. Hitler and his propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels fought a new kind of campaign.
Goebbels would send out movie units that would go out, create a little sort of movie theatre, and then they'd play sort of propaganda films about, you know, the need for the national community to come together. So what he was saying was, look, vote for me and I'll bring stability and I'll bring you a national community and I'll stop all this division and all this fighting in the streets. And he sort of said, you know, and to blame for that are the Marxists, and the Marxists are controlled by Jews, and to blame for our economic problems, it's the Jews as well, because they're involved in Wall Street, so I'll get rid of them. You know, it was a flight towards stability. And you see that a lot. You know, a lot of people say, I voted for them, you know, to bring stability to society.
The real truth is that Hitler was the creation of everybody's imagination. Everyone had their own Hitler. The conservative forces, for example, thought Hitler may be a mad dog, but they could tame him by their salons, by grand banquets, by bringing him into their homes and hearts.
In the September 1930 election, the Nazis won over 6.5 million votes, over 18% of the total. The Nazis were now the second largest party in Parliament. Less than 2 years later, the Germans went to the polls again to elect a president. Hitler stood against Hindenburg.
This is one of history's great set pieces because they had to actually position Hindenburg, who had been in the German army since, I think, 1865, in the war against Denmark, the war against Austria, and was the great hero of the First World War. They had to paint Hindenburg himself as the candidate of the communists and the candidate above all of the Jews. And I mean, Hitler is an ex-corporal fighting a field marshal. It cannot work, it cannot work. It's one of the most bizarre elections of all time. But what we have is Hitler over Germany. Hitler has this airborne campaign where he descends from the clouds in a trimotor, Siegfried-like, one of the gods. And so he can make speeches in 5 different German cities in a single day. He fights that campaign with all the new methods.
Kapitulieren werden wir nicht. Unser deutsches Volk, unser Vaterland, die Bewegung, die beides einmal retten muss.
We have now the point where amplification power in auditoria is much more technically superb. We have the ability to smooth film so that film doesn't shudder. We have radios. It's an entire new world of communication for technological reasons.
Despite victory when it came to propaganda, Hitler lost the election to Hindenburg, garnering just 36% of the vote to Hindenburg's 53%. However, within 4 months, Hitler would have a chance to go back to the electorate in a federal election. This time, it would be an opportunity he wouldn't miss.
It's not like a massive overall majority here, but 37, 38%. It's quite a big proportion of the electorate in the Weimar period. The Nazis are the most popular party in the Weimar period.
The Nazis won 37% of the vote, but they fell back to 33% in another election just 6 months later. There seemed to be a ceiling on Hitler's appeal.
The Nazi party at that time has been called a catch-all party. The Nazi message is whatever you want it to be. Hitler was not offering anything concrete. He was offering emotional spasms, the retrieval of German pride, make Germany great again, the reversal of the verdict of Versailles, of the reparations, the confiscations of territory, the restoration of honor and pride to the German flag. Many people of all kinds were beguiled by this. But the core of the appeal was actually to the group from which Adolf Hitler had himself emerged. It was the lower middle class, and the lower middle class were a huge social group in Germany.
It's the teachers, it's the lawyers, because they fear that they're going to lose their jobs next. It's always the fear. The fear of the middle class person is that, I'm going to lose my house, I'm going to lose my job. This is the panic of the middle classes, and crime is terrible, crime's awful. Of course, the crime never comes down their streets, but it's the fear that occupies their mind. And he played on that fear. And so his big gain in the cities is in the suburban middle class areas, and they start to come over to him. So he starts to unite rural Protestant Germany and middle class suburban Germany, and he brings them all together.
Other social groups, the workers, were much more iffy. So were the upper middle class. I actually discovered from 1932 instructions which ordered the party not to show the swastika very much in middle class areas. It does show how the Nazis understood market segmentation, for one thing, that they had to give different messages to different groups, different messages, for example, to rural groups. They had to stress different kinds of racism in different kind of areas. For example, in areas with no anti-Semitic tradition, they'd not be anti-Semitic. They might be anti-Danish, for example. But he still could not capture the loyalty of large areas of the German public, the factory worker who is a member of a trade union still, the Catholic woman voter. Large sections of the upper middle class would still not be beguiled by Nazis and not voted for him. The sad thing and the tragic thing is that a lot of people who were of sound mind and sane and fair-minded people, and not necessarily wild-eyed fanatics at all, did vote for Hitler. And the interesting question is why people voted for him, and of course it was the last vote they ever had.
After Hitler's electoral success, Hindenburg thought he could use this new force in politics to serve his own ends. On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany.
President Hindenburg, you've got to look at him because really he was trying to create a popular right-wing authoritarian government in Germany. Problem was he couldn't find a charismatic leader. He tried this guy called Heinrich Brüning. He looked like an accountant. And he acted like an accountant. He brought in all these austerity measures. Then he went for Franz von Papen, a communist leader, called him, a Nazi in a pinstripe suit. And he tried to sort of, take Germany massively to the right, and he wanted to create a dictatorship himself.
At the end of February 1933, the Reichstag, the German parliament, was destroyed in a catastrophic fire. No one knows for sure who was responsible. Hitler immediately blamed the communists, and now in a position of real power as Chancellor, he pushed Hindenburg to issue the Reichstag Fire decree.
You have the Reichstag Fire and you have the Reichstag Fire decree, which enables Hitler to actually imprison communists. And remember, there are a lot of communist deputies of the Reichstag, stop them standing, closed down newspapers, closed down communist and socialist PR operations, and so forth. So the Reichstag Fire decree enables the elimination of civil liberties.
In the wake of the fire and the cracking down on left-wing parties, another federal election was called. It saw a tidal wave of violence and oppression led by the SA right across Germany, and many Nazi functionaries were sent to monitor the vote. On the 6th of March 1933, the Nazis became the largest single party, winning nearly 44% of the vote. However, despite tactics of fear and voter suppression, it was way short of an overall majority. It was time to get rid of the electoral process. A fortnight later, with all the communist and some socialist members arrested or prevented from attending, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, giving Hitler the power to pass laws without parliamentary consent.
They then basically abolish democracy. There can be no more elections. The rule will now be from decree with the sanction of the president. Remember, the great pseudo-monarchic figure of Hindenburg is still on the throne. So you have that important continuity. The semblance of democracy or of being a heterogeneous society is continued. In other words, the newspapers are not closed down for the most part, some are, but a lot of them continue to be. They continue in being. It continues to look like old Germany. But the message is internalized by everyone. You have to toe the party line. So they retain the husk of being a normal society. For example, between then and the war, Hitler holds 5 referenda. Of course, they're not real referenda, but the whole machinery of electioneering is cranked up for these so-called referenda. So you still have the facsimile of being a normal Western democratic society. But the fact is that rule is by decree from immediately after the March election, and it is no longer a democracy.
Other political parties were banned, trade unions were forced to dissolve, prominent opposition figures were sent to newly established concentration camps.
The first victims are not Jews. They are communists, they're liberals, they're socialists, they're anyone the regime disapproves of, including some conservatives. Remember, in 1938, the entire right-wing reactionary despotic neo-fascist Austrian regime was put into a concentration camp and emerged as heroes after the war. So the people going in the concentration camps are actually, not for the most part, Jewish. They're there for ideological rehabilitation. Concentration camps are actually sold to the German public. They're open to the public. They're sold in the media as being hives of open-air activity where people are healed. They're places of healing. They're made patriotic again.
In late June, even Hitler's beloved brown shirts, the Sturmabteilung or SA, would experience his ruthless determination to remove any impediment to his personal control. During the so-called Night of the Long Knives, he purged the leadership of the SA together with prominent anti-Nazis. Over 4 days, as many as 1,000 were murdered.
Everything Hitler ever did was make up on the hoof. He was not a strategic thinker. He was a tactician, and sometimes a brilliant tactician, but he was not a strategic thinker. But you come to the inexorable conclusion that you have to eliminate the stormtrooper leadership, and while you're at it, get rid of a few other people who are becoming awkward for the regime and stand in the way of your path to absolute control. You had all kinds of people from the public world who were murdered. General Kurt von Schleicher and his wife were done away with. A mere music critic for a newspaper was done away with, not deliberately, but you had a lot of collateral damage. And by the way, if you kill them, you send a message to the entire nation. Know your place.
A month later, on the 2nd of August 1934, the president, Hindenburg, died. The presidency died with him. Its powers merged with those of the chancellor.
With his death, there is now no intervening power between Hitler and the object of his desire, which is total, indeed you could call it totalitarian, control of the German people. So what Hitler then does is merge the two offices of Chancellor and President. So he becomes both Prime Minister and President. He becomes both monarch and politician. The one thing he does have is not only the powers of the President, but also control of the army. What Hitler wants at this time most of all is control of the army. Hindenburg had it. When Hindenburg goes, Hitler has that control.
The army were made to swear an oath to him personally. He's now known simply as the leader, der Führer. Hitler had been catapulted from a street corner loudmouth into an unassailable dictator in less than a decade. He had been lucky, but he was also a skilled propagandist and a vicious murderer who had ordered the deaths of colleagues, opponents and supporters alike. It was only the beginning.
They were the first, if you like, they were the first of many millions in the end. A long vista of countless millions of people who died as a result of Hitler's actions.